There we
There it
go.
is.
All right. All right, guys. Today we're going to be talking about speech and language disorders. I'm Gregory, and my partner is Miki.
Hello.
All right. So, what is speech and language disorders? So, language and speech is often used very interchangeably. However, we are talking in the context of communication disorders, there are very important differences that need to be considered. And speech is defined, or I should say, speech and language disorders are defined as a communication disorder, such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And that is the IDEA's definition. So those differences that I was talking about when we are in referencing in speech, it has a very more narrow meaning compared to language, where it refers specifically to sounds produced through oral mechanisms such as the lips, your tongue, vocal cords, and like related structures. But it is also speech is the most common way to transmit language. And unlike language, it can be observed very directly, where language refers to the code or symbol system for transforming unobservable like mental like events such as like your thoughts and memories, and you transform those thoughts and memories into events that can be perceived by other people, so basically just talking. And there's two types of languages. There's expressive language or language production, which is your ability to make your ideas into a specific form, or there's receptive language or language comprehension, which is the ability to understand the meanings that others have expressed by using their language. All right. But there's also a lot of cultural considerations that must be made regarding speech and language, specifically that cultures help form social identity and group membership. And it also helps organize cultural beliefs and ideologies. Two ways that are very common when looking at cultural considerations are dialect and accent. And dialect is more referred to on a more like basic level, so they have like a Japanese or a Chinese or an American dialect. Or when it comes to accent, it's like kind of like, oh, you have a southern accent, or you have a English accent. But one thing that educators need to ensure is that just because there is a difference in the way an individual speaks, it does not automatically mean it's a disorder. Just because people originate, as you can see in the image on the right, all over the world. Everyone is a different color, and just because you're a different color does not mean that there's something wrong. We'll move on with a quote, and this was taken from a this educational statistics. This was back in 2017, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate it is for 2020. But of all the students with disabilities that are served under the IDEA, 20% have a speech or language disorder. That is huge.
All right, guys. So now we're going to discuss some of the characteristics of speech and language disorders. So we're going to start with talking about lexical learning and lexical processing and developmental language impairments. That is a vocabulary deficits are common. Language impairments correlates to poor word learning, both incidentally and over more extended periods of explicit instruction. And grammatical deficits might impede vocabulary growth, such as students with language impairment struggle to make syntactical arrangements in their writing and speech. So these impairments lead professionals to design methods of rehabilitations. And after students receive a form of rehabilitation, they can then receive the processing they deserve to determine which specific limitations are holding them back from progressive academic growth. The struggle with vocabulary growth is that students with LIs struggle to make basic meaning comprehension out of sentence structures, and that can be diagnosed early on, between the ages of 3 and 6. So now we're going to be identifying and managing childhood language and speech impairments. So children who have language impairments, when their ability to understand receptive or use expressive language falls below age expectations, those are typically studied when they are in kindergarten. And scientists Neuroscientists classify this as a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's typically related with ADHD, ADD, and autism. Children have language impairments when their ability to understand receptive language falls below the age expectations. Um, so there are studies that are made early on if people are proactive in catching this in their child between the ages of 3 and 6. And language impairments are a part of core symptoms associated with a dysfunction at neurodevelopment. So you can have stuttering, that's associated with a higher maternal education. And there are also outside factors that are highly related to people who develop language or speech impairments, and that falls under socioeconomics. Are their biological needs met? Do students have those students with language or speech impairments? Do they have a father figure? Do they have a maternal figure? Do they have the proper resources to have a progressive academic education? Those are all factors that contribute to identifying early on whether a child has a language or speech impairment. All right, and now we're going to talk about normalizing tests for speech, language, and non-native learners. So there is a lack of appropriate normalized bilingual language assessment tools at the moment. There is all types of studies that have been made, but specifically, there hasn't been a broad, universal normalized assessment tool that people have studied. So typically it goes under screening per person because every child also learns differently. There's a study that I read from an article about Francophone, it's called Francophone Canada Study, and it studied a group of Canadian students who were raised in Quebec but now live in English dominant speaking cities throughout Canada. And they studied that speech language pathologists in Canada studied French speaking natives living in dominant English speaking counties, and they concluded that children struggling with speech and language disorders require reform diagnosis to better suit their developing decline and progression. The reform diagnosis included studies for their prior records in detail and then placing them in monitored, varied context settings to distinguish competencies that are met and which are not. And reform speech testing proved positive in guiding students to the right therapeutical aid in terms of progression. So it's kind of an intense screening where professionals sit in a specific context setting and observe to see certain reactions, and those can also be influenced by behavior. So development, a lot of the articles that we've read talked about pre-kindergarten. That's when teachers specifically are able to pick up on improper like language development and seeing whether kids are not at the same age range in terms of their competency skills. So post preschool education determines children's speech and language skill development. They acquire listening and speaking foundation for reading and writing. And children's speech and language experiences vary substantially regarding familial cultural expectations. So similar to what we're going to talk about hand gestures today in terms of reading for development, there are cultural expectations for varied students that might place an implication on their academic growth in terms of language development and speech as well.
Also, one other thing that we need to make sure that a lot of educators understand is that that we read 3 separate articles, which were 3 separate like case studies that showed a correlation that there was absolutely no evidence that speech or language disorders were more prevalent in those who are bilingual compared to those who are monolingual. So a very large misconception that was made through a lot of the readings that we were looking at was they believed that if a student or a child, I should say, is learning a different language, a lot of it gets kind of melded together and gets misconceived, and teachers and educators start looking at that as an issue, where in reality, through these case studies that all happened at different times, it wasn't an issue. Right. So now we're going to move on to differentiating of varied forms of speech and language disorders. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is speech disorders, and where a speech disorder is considered a condition in which a person has problems creating or forming speech sounds needed to communicate with others. Speech is a very, very complex system with the body, and it requires a lot of coordinated breathing, which is called respiration, with movements that produce voice, which is your phonation, and your sounds, which is articulation. And respiration yields a like stream of breath, which is then changed into vibrations through your laryngeals, and which is your like your voice box and your vocal cords, and then that is what makes the sound coming out with like what you're thinking in your head audible. And speech disorders are typically like deficits that may prevent speech from being produced at all, or they result in speech that cannot be understood, or it's like looked at as abnormal. And four common disorders that we're going to take a look at are articulation, phonological, disfluency, and then the voice or resonance. So, articulation, typically that is conceived as like not being able to produce certain sounds clearly. So a good way to look at it is that it may be consistent, like certain sounds like your R's or your S's may be consistently distorted or changed. So you might sound like you're whistling when you're trying to use an S. And then a lot of the times it's very hard for the people that have problems with articulation to be understood, and a lot of times family members are the ones that are easier to understand. So it creates a very like very self-conscious type thing when you're trying to talk in class and you can't get understood. It makes the student not want to participate any longer. And a good example that we looked at was it was called apraxia, which is a motor speech disorder that affects the way in which a student plans to produce speech. And that can be acquired in many different ways, but it's not limited to trauma, head injury, or it can just occur with any other disorder. And it's also been seen to occur early in life with isolation without trauma as well. Phonological, it's where students or like individuals typically don't use all of their speech sounds to form words. And it happens a lot with consonant sounds, where the consonant might be left out or it might be changed in order to, it sounds a little bit weird. So, like, for instance, book might sound like boo, or like pig might sound like pie. But a lot of times with phonological disorders, it's not, they don't have problems with all words. Like, they can still say words like key or go. It just happens with some. And a good example of that we looked at was dysarthria, which is a medical condition that is like it's caused by medical conditions that impair muscles or nerves that activate those oral mechanisms that we discussed earlier. And dysarthric speech might be difficult to understand because your movements are weakened with your speech, like your vocal cords are weakened, or they might be imprecise, or they just are abnormally slow. So you start talking like that, or you're just very really quick like this. It's really upsetting to see sometimes. Moving on to disfluency, a really good example of disfluency. It's very easy. Everyone probably knows it. It's stuttering. It's a very like repetition of sounds. The like twerking like your head when they're talking, blinking your eyes, and a lot of embarrassment comes with it. Like making words long, just interjecting words where we're saying like when we're trying to get our thoughts together. It's kind of like that. And it happens with a lot of pausing as well. And then voice or resonance is the last speech disorder that we're going to look at. That's typically like hoarseness, your voice breaks, your pitches are constantly going up and down. And the four areas typically are pitch, duration, intensity, and resonance. And with resonance, the way that was looked at is there's hypernasality and then hypnonasality. And hyper is that very nasally voice because a lot of air is coming through the nasal cavity. And hypno is where the air can't pass through the nose, so it sounds like you're holding your nose when you're talking. Language disorders is the next area that we're going to talk about. And this often refers to problems with either development of expressing meaning or message, which is considered expressive, or understanding the message coming from others, which is considered receptive. And there's two areas of association with these disorders are the relation to a disability and then specific language impairment or SLI. And with the association for relation, it's typically like hearing loss, or it's associated with because of an accident where like maybe their vocal cords got severed so they can't really talk anymore, or like intellectual disabilities such as like Down syndrome, autism, like severe autism where they can't express their thoughts anymore out vocally even though they have their own thoughts. And then specific language impairment or SLI is where it has no association to a disability. And studies have shown that it's very believed to have a strong genetic link where about 50 to 70% of those who have an SLI diagnosed actually have another family member that has suffered from an SLI as well. And it typically is diagnosed by speech language pathologists. And some of the symptoms include lateness in forming sentences, difficulty learning new words, limited use of complex sentences, and an frequency in grammatical errors. Now, this graph is a really good example to show you kind of like the similarities and differences between the each areas. And the most common similarity between all the speech, language, and communication needs is phonology, which when we discussed that earlier, that was the missing of like consonant sounds and typically like weak or like you can't pronounce like book, for instance. And then there's similarities between language and speech, and then speech has quite a large amount that's different from the rest. And the two causes that we came across were there was biological causes and environmental causes. Biological, as you can see, is anything that happens with the body. It could be hereditary, it could be through your nervous, your muscular chromosomes, just formation of speech patterns. And then environmental, there actually isn't currently a known cause, but it typically is with like stuttering and those phonological orders that we've been talking about as well.
All right, so now we're going to go over the evaluations of the disorders in terms of the assessment. So the speech assessment is categorized as an oral reading fluency testing, and it is determined heavily by case history, including medical status, education, socioeconomic, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds, information and information from teachers and parents. It requires a review of auditory, visual, motor, or cognitive status. And then they go about determining whether the child needs standardized measures and follow-up services to monitor progression or decline. So the follow-up service to monitor communication and the swallowing status of saliva in terms of their verbal communication ensures an appropriate intervention and support for individuals with identified speech, language, cognitive communication, and or a swallowing disorder. So for language assessments, professionals gather explicit informations similar to the speech from their parents or teachers. And again, this is specifically something that teachers want to catch early on. So that's why kindergarten teachers are taught to be pretty proactive with catching that. They conduct a hearing screening, audiologic assessment, comprehensive language assessment to determine their ability to make meaning of sentence structures, and comprehensive speech and sound assessments. So professionals will gather information from parents and teachers regarding concerns about the child's language development skills in each language, and primarily the language that's studied in that specific school for that specific language. And then professionals will conduct a hearing screening to rule out hearing loss as a possible contributing factor to language difficulties. And then they will administer a formal screening, which assesses the normative data / cutoff scores that demonstrates their evidence, whether it's adequately sensitive or if it's specific to their age range. And then they use informal measures, such as those designed by clinicians and tailored to the populations of preschool from K through 12, and to determine what type of specified developmental strategies need to be put in place in order for progression to be seen. All right, so this diagram is directly from one of our academic articles. It's hearing and seeing meaning in speech and gesture. So similar to what we've learned previously early on in the semester in class, gestures are obviously much different across the board in terms of culture. Some gestures that we consider to be peaceful might be considered really vulgar in other cultures. And speech pathologists studied and found that informational gestures accompany speech comprehension. So gestures are not perceived simply as hand waving or attracting attention to what is conveyed in speech. Um, Listeners and viewers pay attention to iconic gestures and pick up informations that their brains can encode. So these gestures actually activate similar brain areas to those involved in processing semantic information from speech. And students who struggle to comprehend gesture awareness, specifically in class, can be directed and diagnosed early on as having a language impairment deficit. All right, so influences of emotional and behavioral disorders on speech and language impairments. This is the evaluation portion of it. Professionals will study whether there is a struggle with social skills negatively to influence students' ability to participate with peer educational relationships. This is a big deal in terms of partnerships, peer review, and classwork in general for students. Are they falling behind academically? Can they keep up with their peers in terms of progression in class? Do they need a specialized educational plan? Verbal intelligence IQ, is it slow or inactive in terms of their academic achievement? And then they discuss a term that we saw very relevant in most of the articles in terms of behavior. It's called externalizing and not internalizing behaviors associated with low academic performance. And what externalizing is defined as, psychiatrists labeled it as a term to describe specific behavioral disorders featuring problems of self-control, emotions, or behaviors. And sometimes there hasn't really been a statistic number that we've come across, but they're saying that there's a pretty strong correlation that students with behavioral issues tend to struggle in terms of language impairment. Not so much speech impairment, but more so language impairment.
All right. And then the last area of focus that we're going to look at is educational strategies that can be used with those who have speech and language disorders. And one of the main things that we looked at was service delivery models, where this is where a speech language pathologist is collaborating with special and general educators to develop strategies. And it includes three specific areas: settings, intensity and frequency of services, and the role of the speech language pathologist with those students. IDEA actually mandates that individual needs of students must be considered with this process, and that the research-based practices must be implemented in a least restrictive environment for that student. So when we talk about setting, two of the things that we really looked at was pull-out interventions, which is where the student's taking out, or like the small group where they meet with the speech language pathologist in a different area that's secluded from the general classroom. Or there's push-in interventions, where that's the speech language pathologist coming into and kind of team teaching with the educator, where they support students with classwork, or they support small groups with specific activities. And it's really nice because teachers can become more aware of like effective supports and strategies from that speech language pathologist, where the speech language pathologist can also become more familiar with the curriculum and use that with their intervention processes. Intensity and frequency, that's kind of, it sounds exactly like it does, where the most frequent model that's used a lot of the time is that the student's scheduled for a specific time every week. So let's say they meet 2 o'clock on Fridays. Every Friday they will meet 2 o'clock on the same day and time every single week. But there was also another type of like a type of service that could be used, which is called block scheduling, which is kind of different than what we look at when we think about that in like the general classroom, where it just means the interventions are a little bit longer, but they're not as frequent. So instead of maybe every week, it happens every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then the role of the speech language pathologist, there's really three ways that it's looked at. It's in consultation, supportive teaching, and complementary teaching. And their role always varies due to like the provisions that are needed for their services of that student. And not one way is used with all students. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is some instructional strategies. Here are 4 strategies right here: visual supports, graphic organizers, visual schedules, and visual timers. I liked all 4 of them. They're actually really, really nice into helping these students that maybe suffer with speech or language. And for visual supports, the first one that we're going to talk about is it really helps reduce difficulties with reading and writing, and it takes a very, very wide variety of forms, and it's really common in assisting in communication of what's expected of those students, and it decreases demand on them because it's another way where they can communicate what their needs. So like for instance, if they struggle with those consonant sounds and clean teeth is one of those like really hard phrases they can't talk about, now they can demonstrate it through a visual because they can point at that visual on the wall if it's somewhere in the classroom. The second one, graphic organizers, it's kind of how it sounds. It's a form of visual support that acts as like an advanced organizer that helps them with like a more organized framework for their thoughts, and it assists them in comprehending and writing more effectively, which it's very typical when you think about like a Venn diagram, which is that picture down there. The third one, visual schedules. The primary purpose for visual schedules is to communicate to students like the activities and events that are being encountered, whether it be throughout a lesson or just throughout the day. So like good way to like think about it is like a chalkboard, and block 1 from 7 to 9:30, for instance, that's block 1. Then it will go block 2 is from 9:35 to 11 o'clock or something. It's just a way to where they can see the course of events that are happening. That way it's easier for them to communicate what they need to do next. And then the last one, visual timers. There's multiple ways that it can be done, but really it just helps relay information on how long a particular task is going to last. That way it's easier for them to have time management skills and to vocalize how much longer they have with specific events. These are the references that we use to come up with all these articles, and I really appreciate you guys' time and listening in.
Thank you, guys.
All right.